Good evening. Welcome to Navigating the Noise, Election Coverage in the Digital Age, a virtual conversation presented by the Center for Brooklyn History and the Social Science Research Council. I'm Marcia Eli, Director of Programs at the new Center for Brooklyn History. For those of you who knew us as the Brooklyn Historical Society, I'm excited to share that we are now in our third week as a center of the Brooklyn Public Library. This change means all good things for telling the story of Brooklyn and for bringing you, as we always have, thought-provoking and powerful conversations. Tonight will be that and more, as we welcome 4 scholars to explore the critical topic of how we, as citizens in this crucial election year, receive information about candidates running for office. Before I turn this over, I want to invite all of you to chime in with your questions throughout the program. You can share them by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my partner in this event, Michael Miller, the Program Director of the SSRC's Media and Democracy Program. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Marcia, and good evening, everyone. Really delighted to welcome you to this event, a collaboration between the Center for Brooklyn History and the Social Science Research Council. For those of you who are less familiar with the Social Science Research Council, we are an independent international nonprofit organization founded in 1923 and located in Brooklyn, New York. Tonight's event emerges from our Media and Democracy program, which was created in 2016 with the support of the Knight Foundation to explore the ever-evolving relationship between media, technology, and politics, with the recognition that media and media infrastructure can be deployed in support of democratization, transparency, and public empowerment, and likewise also in support of authoritarianism, surveillance, disinformation, and control. The Media and Democracy program is part of a larger sweep of programs, projects and initiatives at SSRC related to media, technology, and politics, including the disinformation research mapping platform MediaWell, which you can find at mediawell.ssrc.org, which curates news, reports, policy, and research on disinformation. We invite you to learn more about all these programs at ssrc.org. But without any more ado, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's panel, which include Julia Azari, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University.
Thank you so much for having me.
Julia. Michael Wagner, who is Professor of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Wisconsin.
It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Claire Wardle, Founder and Director of First Draft.
Good evening, everybody.
And tonight's discussion will be moderated by Johanna Dunaway, Professor of Communication at Texas A&M University.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here.
So thank you again to the Center for Brooklyn History and to our panelists. Johanna, please take it away.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here tonight. We don't have a ton of time, so I want to go ahead and get to the questions because we want to make sure we have time for audience questions towards the end. So I want to start with some just general press performance evaluations, questions this cycle so far. Claire, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. So you might know, I'm sure you do know, that after every cycle, there's usually some polling organization or journalistic organization that asks the voters what grade they would give the press, right? Following any election, how well did they do covering it? What do you think that the press or that the public will say this year about the press's performance?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask what I would say. I would give them a D. I actually think the public would probably say a C. But I think those of us who understand the role the media plays will recognize that the lessons from 2016 have just not been learned. So the both sidesism, the focusing on the horse race, all of the stuff that political scientists have been talking about for years has not changed. And I spend all day looking at disinformation. So I spend a lot of my days working with journalists trying to convince them not to cover disinformation stories because they will take small kernels of disinformation and give it oxygen and turn it into something that it doesn't need to be. So it's difficult to sit here on October 20th and look at the coverage and think, I still don't think that newsrooms are doing what they need to do, which is help voters understand what the issues that they care about, what's the information, how can they source that information. So there's lots to say about this around the business models, and it's been a very difficult year for the news industry, but I don't want to say that's the only reason we're where we are today.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned your grade, because that was my follow-up. And so I'm going to kick that follow-up still to Mike and Julia. So Julia, I'll let you chime in first if you have anything to add about your own personal assessment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been a little bit, I was on a panel earlier this year where I was accused of kind of grade inflation for the press in 2016, because I think the press has a hard job. I also might be a little bit biased here because while I'm a political science professor by day, I write for 538 sometimes, and I feel like I've been in on at least some of these conversations about how to cover this stuff. And I think that it's not an obvious question. And this is also a question I face in the classroom as a political science professor, of how to navigate the tension between the abnormal and the authoritarian and the anti-democratic, and also the persistent presence of normal political forces. There are days where certain things do look sort of as you would expect, as kind of average partisanship, whatever. So I think there's not an obvious answer to that question. I know that out of media studies, there have been more kind of answers about this sort of thinking in a more citizen-centric way, but I also do wonder about news consumption and about who is consuming these horse racy stories or these both sides stories. And I do wonder kind of who is driving some of these decisions or what forces are driving them. So I have punted on giving a grade, but I think my grade is like sort of a B-.
Okay, great, thank you. Mike, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I would say, if I had to grade the media, which of course there's not the media, right? But I would say probably a C, because I think there's been some coverage, really, I think at strong local papers especially, that have done a good job learning from 2016. So I'm thinking of coverage in the Tennessean and the Carolina Public Press, where they have published deep stories about here's what you can expect on election day. Here's what you can expect with early voting and the counting of votes. And these are normal processes that are going to take more time because more people are voting in ways that aren't showing up in person on election day. So some places I think we could give an A to, and others I would say we could give a D or an F, because as Claire was saying before, there's a lot of coverage that looks a lot like 2016. Donald Trump continues to get way more coverage than Joe Biden. And while on the one hand, he's president, so he can do his job and get news attention, the disparity in attention is a non-trivial aspect of how candidates can make their case to the voters. And then of course the kinds of things that get covered and how they get covered with respect to the game frame and following these claims that are wild and unsupported or outright known to be false are also huge problems. And all of that happens in the context Julie was saying. And so I think there's some things to be happy about. There's some things to worry about. And I don't know that en masse we could say journalists writ large have fundamentally made a course correction based upon what we saw in 2016. But enough folks are doing things that are interesting that at least is getting more attention than maybe it got 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's great. And also just to agree with you on the point of the variation across the press. Mm-hmm. So in the interest of time, I kind of composed a lot of these asking about the press as a whole, but anytime you want to give answers that are more nuanced about the different types of press we have, please do. I just couldn't quite figure out a way to work that into my question structure, but that is absolutely the case. So I think that's excellent to point out. Okay, so this sort of taps on some of the things that you guys have already mentioned. Sticking generally with the same theme, it seems like the media, again, broadly, are in a catch-22 to some extent when it comes to covering elections, right? They've got to be, or at least ideally according to their democratic watchdog role, they've got to be critical of these candidates, reporting on them in like a hard-hitting way. At the same time, doing so does a number of things, right? It feeds dislike and distrust of partisans on the other side from that candidate, which is already a problem. We've got rising affective polarization. It may also feed distrust of the press from the perspective of the audience member who is watching the press criticize their favorite candidate. And at the same time, the kind of he said, she said, objective style of reporting that tends to be a little bit surface level doesn't really win them any points either, or tell the voters much about what they need to know. And then if they add a bunch of conflict into that framing, that almost exacerbates the other problems too, the rising polarization and distrust. So Julia, this time I'll start with you. To what extent do you think this catch-22 is part of the challenge that creates these kinds of stories that we often see that are somewhat less satisfying?
So
you can talk about any sort of type you like of stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is related to the point I brought up before about the normal abnormal tension. I think there's, like, on the one level, that the press has an obligation to be the resistance to not only to whoever is in power, but also to and to hold, you know, powerful people to account, but also to kind of point out the ways in which political actors in our system now have openly disavowed core democratic values. At the same time, that actually feeds into that political narrative of the Trump movement, right? Where, like, the press, you know, this was one of the dynamics that that I really picked up on in that first debate, was this idea that Trump said, "Oh, I guess I'm debating you," to the moderator, and like that, like dumping on the press is a way to kind of speak to that base. So I think there is a really deep catch-22, and it's not really clear how to talk about a system that is so asymmetric and so flooded with anti-democratic ideas that are competing in a democratic context. So I wish I had a great answer to this. My answer in my own writing has been increasingly to kind of just say it, but I also have a whole other job, so I'm not as dependent on some of these newsroom dynamics.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I mean, to your comment, I think it does tend to fall on deaf ears whenever journalists point out to the candidates or their surrogates or the campaign surrogates that they aren't campaigning against the press themselves. I'm not sure to what degree the audience picks up on that or cares about it. So I think it is problematic.
I mean, I would just jump in very quickly to say the campaign for the last 4 years from President Trump to undermine the media and to use the term fake news, I would argue, you know, he was setting himself up for when the New York Times published his tax reports, he could immediately say that. And I think, I mean, just the other day I did a Reddit session, and every question from the public was about, well, I can't trust any media. I mean, you convince me that there's any media that I can trust. And I know that we sort of talk about it in an academic way, but I think we really have to take seriously that really has worked. The booing at the rallies, at the press, the way that it gets talked about has had an impact, and there will be PhD dissertations about it, but it's absolutely real. And I do think that the catch-22 piece is, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Brooklyn, and I come from a country where we are much more used to hard-hitting interviews where the journalists really ask those questions. And the access journalism in this country, which is CBS doesn't want to upset. I mean, Trump walked out of a Leslie Stahl interview this evening. I mean, that's kind of unheard of. Like, I don't like the questions I'm being asked by the journalist, I'm going to walk off. I mean, this is unprecedented. But because there hasn't, I would argue, hasn't been a precedent in this country for those kind of hard-hitting interviews, it means that when journalists push Trump much more firmly, he goes, "Oh, I'm being treated unfairly." And that's problematic, because that's the role of the press. And so I think we've set ourselves up also by not being tough enough early enough. And now he can call out saying this is unfair.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to a little bit more maybe 2020 specific type themes. Well, maybe not, I guess, recent years. Things we've seen a lot more in recent years is maybe the way I should say it. So the misinformation problem, the unfounded claims problem. There's lots of misinformation out there from all different kinds of sources, much of which is actually also coming from candidates and campaigns or their surrogates. And maybe with the exception of the Savannah Guthrie interview with Trump the other night, the problem of dealing with unfounded claims, and this is maybe an arguable point, and you're free to argue, of course, with it, but it seems to have posed a daunting challenge in a lot of settings for at least some members of the press, and they don't quite know how to deal with it or haven't dealt with it in a super effective manner. And so, Mike, I'm going to give this one to you first. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Am I wrong? Have they handled it well? Are there particular outlets or journalists that you've seen sort of shine on this, or have you seen like sort of a lackluster ability of dealing with it altogether? What's your sense?
I thought, President Trump faced greater scrutiny with respect to the completely unfounded and usually false claims that he makes from Savannah Guthrie in that town hall. I thought there was that Axios interview he did where he got some more of those kinds of questions. But as Claire was saying, we really see that more from journalists in England and New Zealand, and those are the things that are making the rounds for journalists asking hard-hitting questions. And it may be that journalists are asking hard-hitting questions, but they're not doing it in a way that most voters are seeing. And that, I think, is one problem, because let's say journalists solve the problem of this thing we've been talking about. It's the case from social science research that suggests when journalists do say, here's the verifiable truth, quite often they can get a significant portion of the public to then accept that and then judge that media source as biased, because that news source has slanted to the verifiable truth and not to this objective kind of, one side says X, the other side says Y kind of storytelling that they've been conditioned to like. And this has been a long time coming, right? I mean, in Jonathan Ladd's book, Why Americans Hate the Media and How It Matters, he has this quote from Newt Gingrich, where Gingrich, I think when he was Speaker of the House in the 90s, just said, I'm going to attack you because that's good for me. That's good for my party. We're going to say you're the problem, and that's what we're going to do, and tough luck. And that's, reached a fever pitch, I think, in 2020. And I think President Trump has taken that to a new level with the booing of, that Claire was talking about before and things like that.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And kind of a follow-up that's got a little bit of a more specific bend to it, but I know, at least broadly speaking, we often fault social media platforms and the people who run them for some of this as being, I just mentioned that a lot of this is coming directly from candidates and campaigns, but a lot of it isn't, and a lot of it's coming from, a wide range of different types of information sources, many of which appear to many people through these platforms. I'm thinking specifically of Twitter's recent effort to try to avoid circulating what they viewed as an unverified news story from the New York Post. But of course that was met with wide criticism. And so I guess I have two questions on this. So to what extent do you kind of agree with this sort of conventional wisdom or notion or often made claim that social media platforms are a big part of the problem? But maybe more importantly, or the more important question might be, to what extent can they be part of the solution? Mm-hmm. Or is it going to be that there are too many constraints against them and preventing them from doing so? So I'm going to give this both to Claire and Julia. I don't know which of you wants to go first. Claire, I typed your name first, so I'm going to give it to you first.
I mean, certainly so much of this stuff spreads on social media, and they are definitely part of the problem. But I think, we're on a panel talking about news coverage, and I do think the news media has to consider its role in amplification. And I mean, we did a bit of work with the Internet Archive and looked at the times that CNN, MSNBC, and Fox had put up Trump's tweets on screen, not just talked about them, on screen with no flags or anything else. Over 1,000 for Trump compared to, 80 for Biden. And out of Trump's tweets about saying that the election was fraudulent or rigged, only 5 were labeled by Twitter, but 40 of them were put on screen by these outlets. So I think, yes, the social media platforms are, of course, a problem, but they are conduits for mainstream media, journalists themselves, and the public, and disinformation actors. So, I mean, we are very early in the journey of learning what works or not. And I think all of us on this panel are scholars. One of my frustrations is a number of the interventions being made by platforms, for example, adding labels and flags and other things. We don't know what that does to audience behavior. Early research that we've done shows that the left loves labels, the right absolutely hates them. It drives down trust in information flows entirely. So if Twitter is taking down more accounts, instinctively we might be like, that's a good thing. But who's making those decisions? Where's the transparency? So we also have to be really careful that we're not sleepwalking in to a ton of interventions from the platforms without any oversight whatsoever and no understanding of actually what this is doing to the information ecosystem. So yes, a big part of the problem, they will be part of the solution, but we have to help them as opposed to just trusting these decisions that they're making that are political and to help them with congressional inquiries next year.
Great, thank you. Julia.
Yeah, so I have to admit, like, I haven't thought as much about social media as part of the solution, and I tend to think about social media as it is a kind of vector for things to be shared widely. But even you're thinking about Twitter, obviously, is a platform for wide dissemination, but is also, like, as in the broader scope of things, kind of a niche website. It's actually not used as widely. It's not used as widely as Facebook, and people don't get their news from there as much as they do from TV. And there, I kind of want to make 2 points. I might be answering your earlier question, but I do want to speak to both this disinformation and this distrust piece. And the point that I want to make is to contextualize both of them in a bigger conversation. I'm glad Mike brought up Jonathan Ladd's Why Americans Hate the Media. So that's from 2012, right? That book well predates the Trump administration. And I think, so we have this kind of distrust. And I also, at the risk of both siding this, I want to say at the outset that the way that Trump has talked about journalists is dangerous, and has taken things to a whole different level. That doesn't mean that Democratic politicians haven't also used the media in their anti-institutionalist rhetoric. Sanders has done it, Bernie Sanders has done it, Obama also did it. I recently wrote a book chapter on populism where I looked at a lot of Obama's speeches when he was actually stumping for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And he didn't say anything terrible about the media, right? He didn't call them enemies of the people. He did say that the media are responsible for kind of making us think we're more polarized than we are. And I think that's still a kind of anti-institutional sentiment and a way of shifting blame. And he said similar kind of anti-Washington things too. So I think that there's a very strong context of anti-institutionalism that transcends both parties, even if it's taken very different directions at this moment within those two parties. The thing about disinformation that I want to emphasize is that typically when I think about disinformation on social media, it's what we're talking about are stories that are verifiably false, right? But I think the deeper disinformation problem is frames that are misleading about factually true information. And that, I think, is really what sort of distorted people's perceptions and moved people to make political decisions that are anti-democratic and not in their interests, to say nothing of their fellow Americans. I mean, I was really struck reading Molly Ball's biography of Nancy Pelosi, and she talks about the way that Fox News portrayed some of the decisions Pelosi made when she was first elected speaker in 2007, and it was like she had rented some kind of plane or something, and it was like very typical what she did, but it was framed as if it was, you know, she was spending taxpayer money on a luxury jet. And it was, I mean, we could debate about how much money should be spent on X or Y, or about Nancy Pelosi's policy views. All of that is up for debate, but it was very like, it was like, this is a very standard thing, and it's been framed in this particular way. And I see that as a much deeper problem than fake news stories. And I think that's sort of like, I think about that a lot.
Yeah, and just very quickly, compared to 2016, we saw more fabrications. And then as the platforms have moved against that, it gets fact checks, it gets taken down in the algorithm. Exactly as you're saying, Julia, is a lot more of what we see is genuine content, but without context or framed or walked in misleading ways. That doesn't cross any policy bar for the platforms. It's just speech. And therefore it's just this constant drip, drip, drip of this kind of speech that nobody can do anything about. So yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah, I guess I would jump in there too and just say that is something I'm really worried about as the votes are being counted. Journalists, I think, will feel incredible pressure to say, there's chaos, there's
Mhm.
uncertainty. And really what's happening is a normal counting of votes.
Right.
And these things can be framed as the votes are being counted as they always are by the rules they always follow. And then journalists, I think, would also then need to avoid amplifying unfounded speculation, especially on social media, but in other places too, by elites who have a stake in the outcome, who are happy to say this is unfair. This is, as the mail-in ballots get counted and the candidate leading shifts, that's fraud. These are the kinds of things that are going to be said, and journalists, I think, need to prepare. And they need to prepare their audiences for how they're going to cover these campaigns so the audience can be prepared for a slow count that's typical and not chaotic.
Great, thank you. So I have another related question. Maybe this one doesn't require quite as much because it's a problem that we've had around for a long time, and it's somewhat related to this, but I know this is a problem that drives journalists nuts. It drives me nuts as an audience member. Whenever it's the broader problem of just question dodging and the problem of candidates just and their surrogates and the campaigns refusing to directly answer any question and just rigidly adhering to these talking points, is there anything, that they could do to get around this problem a little bit better? I mean, is there a model we can look to? Because more aggressive questioning, at least often, doesn't tend to produce much more. And again, I worry about that problem of feeding that dislike and distrust of the trust even more, or even having, increasing polarization of the affective sort and response among viewers. And it's not just the debates, it's on the weekly and nightly news programs. We see it like throughout all of these venues. And so I just wondered about that particular kind of the avoidance of questions dilemma. I forgot who I called on first, but I'm going to call on Claire again.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to do a better job in the media. When I say we work with the media, but to talk about the tactics. I mean, the amount of media training that these guys now get and how easy it is to avoid a question. I think it's about how do we bring in other voices to explain these topics and just throw our hands up and be like, the politician themselves might not be the best person to give the full context to this. It's just not. And they are now very, very well trained in avoiding it. And I think, one of the issues we have is that journalists have been terrible at explaining how the sausage is made. And that's partly why we're in this place now, where people don't trust journalists. They don't understand that things are fact-checked and there's double sources. They don't understand what anonymous sources is. And they don't understand how an interview gets put together and how in that question, you only have a certain amount of time. And if somebody's evade, you keep asking the same question, but that's not good television. Whatever. I'd love a good Netflix documentary that just goes into all of this and really explains and exposes the way that spin doctors control these narratives. And then let's bring in new voices from communities that are rarely heard. I don't know. That's a simplistic answer, but I don't see any other way that we're magically going to get the answers that we want.
Julia or Mike, you want to add anything, Julia?
Sure. Yeah. So I feel like I keep begging your questions, Johanna. They're wonderful questions. I'm just, I think they're like inspiring me to think about new things. And I think I agree with Claire about just like talking to other people. But when you ask that, and I've been thinking a lot about this because of the vice presidential debate. I was talking to my students about the vice presidential debate and how it like seemed very much like a standard debate. And then you walked away and you were like, wait, no one answered any questions. But then I was kind of thinking, what do we want to get out of these questions? Like, we can find out about policy positions, right? The world is flooded with information about where the two parties stand on public policy, and to the degree we're going to get serious policy depth, it's not going to happen in that context probably anyway. I mean, maybe, right? And we might all vary in terms of what we think is policy depth or how much we need to know. But one thing I do think is useful is asking people to explain their political evolution or their past position or decisions that they've made. And I actually think running for president, one of the most important things is how a person makes decisions. So on the one hand, we've become really obsessed in American politics with authenticity and with like seeing into the soul of the presidential candidates. It might be just as useful to build on what Claire said, to think about, like, if you're going to ask Joe Biden, what were your thoughts when you were voting for the crime bill, which we've heard a lot about? you could actually ask someone who was a legislative analyst in the 90s, right? Or someone who was following politics closely, a political scientist who has studied that period, and just kind of say, look, what were the political incentives? What was the political conversation like? Who were the interest groups that were involved in this process? And again, it won't give you Joe Biden's soul. It won't. But it will give you a picture of the political scene, and then you might even have more success at a certain point asking him a question that's more rooted in that context.
Great, thank you. Mike?
I would add, I guess, a couple things. One is that when politicians don't answer questions, it's because the question is about something that's bad for the politician. And so I think journalists outing that can make it harder to avoid the question, and just make the question frame say, some of the areas where you're evaluated more poorly than your opponent, or something that happened during your administration that didn't go as well as the previous is this. What do you have to say about that? And it makes it a little bit harder, or at least more obvious, that the question's getting avoided. But like Amber Boydston and Rebecca Glazier have done the great research of presidential debates showing when candidates spin away and don't answer questions that are asked of them. But I think Julia's point is a great one, in that the booking wars and the kind of the behind the scenes race to get people on air to fill time greatly affect what kinds of things get discussed and how they get discussed. And there's a premium placed on speaking in sound bites and being able to stop when a producer tells you you've got 20 seconds in your ear to know to stop talking, rather than to lay out all of that crucial information. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's a lot of great work suggesting that exactly the kind of thing we want to know, that Julia was talking about, how do people make decisions, is exactly not the stuff that gets covered about presidential candidates. And the huge disconnect there, I think, doesn't do us any services. I wish I had a great solution and a wand to wave to bring those solutions onto us.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm shifting topics just a tiny bit again. So following 2016, as you all know, you've all alluded to it, I think, in one way or another, there was a lot of criticism about 2016 election, in particular, the disproportionate amount of coverage that Trump got, especially during the primary season, I think received a lot of criticism, because, that's a critical time for getting noticed by audiences and members of the press and donors and all of that. And the interesting thing about this too is the sort of journalism dilemma of when to ignore and when to cover Trump is something that journalists widely admit struggling with, right? They bemoan the set of constraints that they're under, in the sense that they realize there are times where they shouldn't cover. And this is not just a Trump problem, by the way, but really anyone who's kind of skilled at knowing when to try to distract the press, right? And so they often cite the sort of economic constraints that they're under, and the fact that they would be basically handing over more audience ratings and more readers and more clicks to their nearest competitor if they don't make that choice. Yet we've seen the stats from this cycle, or I've already seen some sets of analyses that show, and some of you have mentioned it, the disproportionate focus he's still getting. I guess my question is this: given the constraints that they're under, how can we expect any 1, 2, 3 outlets, or any handful of outlets, to make this kind of decision, to make more careful decisions about when to cover him, when it's warranted and when not to? And then much less, how do we expect the entire press to try to make sounder decisions about this? And this one I'll give to Julia first.
Yeah, I think this is really tricky. One of the things that I had noted in the piece that that Mike actually invited me to write for Political Communications Forum about how the news media helped nominate Trump was the presentation of him in a way that helped him fit in people's existing schema of a president, and how that happened in 2015 and 2016. And I think that idea can sort of be helpful in thinking about covering him when he actually is in that role, right? So you can actually use that schema as a contrast. And I think that's somewhat underutilized. I've tried to write, again, in more data journalism capacity, about how Trump compares with past presidents and what's similar and what's different. But I think that that could also be used in other contexts to try to understand, what doesn't fit that role, and the role of the presidency as not just like the person who speaks and kind of symbolizes the nation or increasingly symbolizes a party, but the role of the president as a constitutional office that has not just powers and limits, but obligations. And that, I feel like institutional frames are really underutilized. And I know you say institutions and like half the audience is asleep, but we got to make institutions sexy again. And I think that might, that would be one way to think about how to depict what Trump says and does.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move on. I had one more question in this little area, but since we're getting short on time, I've got one. This one I'm going to put to you first, Mike. So every time I hear a news story right now about even the smallest problems associated with voting, whether it's mail-in voting, absentee voting, or just anything questioning how well the voting is working at this point. And I know it's the duty and obligation of the press to honestly report on those events, but I'm also, every time I hear it, I cringe because I feel like, is this feeding the narrative that there's going to be overwhelming voter fraud through, mail-in ballots? And I just wonder if you have any suggestions, Mike, on, how the press can grapple with this dilemma, whether they think that in reporting these issues, they're somehow muddying the claims that or the sort of reporting that they're doing when they're talking about how, at least when Trump makes claims about widespread problems with vote-in ballots, how can they turn on one hand and report on an issue and then turn around and remind the audience that this isn't actually a big problem?
So I think, one thing journalists could do is cultivate local experts on elections, and then also place at the center of their coverage election administrators and the voters. And so rather than the kind of lazy framing of, well, some people say there's a lot of questions about these kinds of ballots, why not just do a story that says, I'm here with the election administrator in Dane County, Wisconsin. How do you count them? What do you do with the ballots on election day? What do you do with the ones that get mailed in? What do you do with the absentee votes that get brought to those collection boxes? Tell us where they sit, how you count them, who does it, who gets to watch, who gets to ask questions about it. And just as a matter of fact, say, here's how our institutions work. That is much more informative. And it also pushes back, I think, against the idea that stories about elections have to have conflict to be valuable for the audience.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have anything quick on that?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'll say that a lot of local newsrooms are doing pre-bunks where they're essentially saying it's likely you're going to see this. So if you see very long lines, it's because everybody's standing 6 feet apart. If the paper gets stuck in the machine, it's because everybody's using hand sanitizer, which is making the paper damp, which means that the machines are getting stuck. If you see somebody is flipping the vote, it's because the machine is probably 20 years old and the glue has dried, but it's okay, you'll have another machine to vote on. So election officials are actually working very hard on a lot of these kind of pre-bunks, which I think is great, because rather than debunking on the day, it's much more effective to prime people to say, you might see this, but don't worry.
Great, thank you. Julia, did you have anything?
No, I mean, I've been sort of thinking a lot about this, but I feel like I've said a lot, so I'll.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is sort of related, and I'll give you this one first anyway. So if the election is contested, right, and we know that it might be reported on like a crisis. We know there's lots of problems, or at least there has been historically, with crisis reporting, especially as it unfolds. Do you think the press will be able to avoid some of the common pitfalls that come with this kind of, reporting on an event that's scary to people as it unfolds? And how might they do it if you think that they might be able to avoid those problems?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think a lot of people have been working very hard on this, and it seems like there's been a lot of attention in some of the mainstream, like the print legacy media, on election administration, and also that there's an awareness that there's a lot of scrutiny on news media, and there is some evidence that news media are responsive to these kinds of things. Like after 2000, we saw a change in the way that networks make calls, but there is also an element of fighting the last battle. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not totally sure, honestly, what will happen. I do think I think maybe kind of answer your last question. I think one element of this that is really important and will be important in a contested election or just in general is to report that it's normal that there's a lot of regional variation in the way that ballots are counted and the way that election laws work. That's, I think, really surprising to a lot of people. But that is not unusual. And if you heard one thing in New York and your friend in Pennsylvania heard another thing, it's because you live in different states and there are different rules. I think that's, I mean, we could debate again about whether that's good, but it's true. And so it's normal that this would be a little patchwork and feel a little bit complicated. And also, as Claire was saying, it's normal that these things would feel a little bit complicated in a pandemic context. So I think that's really important to emphasize and might be part of that kind of coverage, that emphasis on decentralization and locality.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you. Okay, so Claire and Mike, I'm going to kind of, well, let me give this one to Claire, and then I'm going to ask you to maybe just take like less than a minute to respond, and then I've got one that I'll let Mike respond to end us before we move to Q&A. So research from cognitive sciences, as you know, and some of you have alluded to this as well, shows that the repetition of claims, whether they're true or false, tends to increase the likelihood that people believe them. And we've been hearing for months that the mail-in ballots produce widespread voter fraud. And so my question is, to what extent are we worried that the public is already primed to question the election themselves in their own minds, and or be especially susceptible to false claims about there being some massive problem?
Yeah, I'll just say the easy answer is yes. I think the audience has been primed. I think we can do these pre-bunks and explainers, but I am worried about the ability, on the November 3rd, the evening, to continue. I mean, again, this has been a deliberate campaign to make people think. Even the word rigged is a deliberate word that's being used, and I worry that it is going to come back if we have this interregnum period. It's going to do the work without anybody having to question it. And because it's an incredibly confusing system, it's very easy to, take that priming and believe it.
Okay, and Mike, so I'm going to say this as quickly as I can and let you respond in also less than a minute. So I had a friend and colleague raise a provocative point. So talking about the last 2 election cycles, maybe it's just Trump, maybe it's polarization, whatever. News and politics, or interest in news and politics, is much higher, which is great for the news business. But all of the things that might be contributing to what's good for the news business might be bad for democracy. He said it a little bit differently, but I'm trying to say it in a more kind of even-handed way. Do you think that's true, or just can you comment on whether you think that what we're experiencing might be good for news but bad for democracy?
I think some of the things that have been good for news are bad for democracy, and the things that are rooted in this deeply affectively polarized set of conflict frames where people can make unsubstantiated claims that get amplified on social media and covered again by news organizations, who then decide, well, we also need to get the reaction from the other side because that's fair. I think those sorts of things are bad, generally bad for democracy. And I think we would be better served if newsrooms filtered their decisions about how to cover the election through the lens of democracy and thinking, what things do we have to repeat to emphasize that this is how elections operate? How can we not amplify baseless claims, even if they're made by newsworthy sources? One thing that I sometimes get pushback from on journalists are, well, when the president says it's news, yes, but lots of things are news. There are many people on the planet who do many things every day. 8 of them get on the front page of the New York Times. You don't have to choose to amplify that, even if it is news. Instead, journalists could consider lessons from science reporting and have expert sources, not partisan ones. I don't think it would be good, for example, for democracy to have Joe Biden on election night or Donald Trump on election night saying, yep, these ballots, I trust them. Like, that's not the source we want. We want to hear from people who study this stuff, people who are in charge of executing elections in the United States to help, I think, improve the confidence that we would have in what's happening from November 3rd to whenever the counting stops.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to turn to our first question from the audience. So this one's for Claire. How can U.S. journalists be supported or trained to act in the challenging ways you described and help us get the information we need rather than a nice show. So.
Yeah, I mean, I lead an organization called First Draft. We do a lot of this training. The Solutions Journalism Network does a lot of this training, but I often will do a day-long training. At the end, they say, that was great, Claire, thanks so much. But unless you bring my editor into this, it's not going to change a thing, because I have metrics I have to reach every month. And the kind of stuff that you're telling me not to report on, or to report it more responsibly, means it'll affect our bottom line. So we can't really have this conversation without thinking about the economics of all of this. And so there is training, we are trying, but there are bigger constraints on the industry that we can't ignore, unfortunately.
Oh, great, thank you. So this is another question. This one's to all panelists. Do press organizations do any kind of feedback, polling, inquiry to see how their stories land and how they affect the audience members after, you know, reading their stories or watching their stories? And when you talk about serving the people, how do we know what the people think serves them well?
That's a hard question, because what people think serves them well isn't always the thing that does serve them well. Like I think oatmeal chocolate chip cookies serve me well, but they don't, right? You know, and so I think part of the issue, and I think we can learn a little bit from some research done by folks like Talia Stroud at the University of Texas, where when journalists are offering kind of transparency cues, so here's who we interviewed and why, here's who edited the story, here are all the changes that we've made, here are any corrections we had to do, that appears with the story, those kinds of things I think can help. But to answer the question, yeah, news organizations definitely survey people to inquire about how some of their stories are landing. They look at the metrics of, are they getting clicked on, shared, or what are the comments like? Are the comments civil or uncivil? You know, are they being shared on social media? That all matters, and you know, it speaks to the point Claire was making to the first question.
Julia, did you want to chime in?
The only thing I would add to that is that it's incredibly difficult to figure out how media is affecting the audience. This is a challenge that researchers really face, and I think one of the challenges in that context, and the reader's suggestion is a good one, it's just very difficult, is that you don't really have a good sense of, like, did someone click on this story because they kind of already think that? I mean, probably, we know probably that's what happened. But it would be very kind of labor intensive for everybody to like pre-test them, right? Like you have to survey them first and then survey them afterward and say, okay, did this story change your mind? So to get an accurate read on the impact of media is just an incredibly challenging endeavor that, you know, people are working hard on, but is not easy.
Claire, did you have anything to add to that one?
No, very quickly, I'll go back to my across the pond experiences, is that, you know, the UK, when you have public service broadcasting, there's a real sense from the journalists that they are trying to help the audience. And when I sometimes bring that up to American journalists, like, oh, no, it's not our job to help the audience. We're here to hold the powerful accountable. I don't write an investigation to try and make, and it's a very interesting kind of difference in the way that journalism is constructed in this country. And I think it's fascinating. But I think we also have to think about those things, because there's not many American journalists like, I'm doing this to help the audience. They're doing this. It's really fascinating.
I'm sure that comparison is fascinating. Okay, so one more question, or the next question. So this again is to all panelists. What is your opinion on news organizations that do not shade or hide their political bias? I assume they mean kind of these branded outlets that, you know, sort of clearly lean one way or the other. Organizations that not only strongly show their support for one ideology or partisanship, but go out of their way to disparage those that oppose the views that they've sided with. I'm rewording a little bit as needed. So who would like to take that one first?
Very quickly, I'll just say, the night that President Trump went into the hospital, I was flicking between Fox and CNN, and a lot of Fox's coverage was taking clips from CNN and saying, look how terrible CNN's coverage is of President Trump going to hospital. And it was this moment of like they were basically doing media criticism as part of their output. So I don't think we study this enough, but I think whoever asked the question is spot on, is that there's something very serious going on there about how this is being discussed.
Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, on the one hand, I think, you know, we have a very strong kind of First Amendment culture here, and so you want to have an ideological network, knock yourself out. And I think that in some ways these networks are very straightforward about what they are, but I do think that the audience member really touches on something critical here, which is there's ideology and there's the way you talk about your opponents. I think it would be more responsible to say, fine, again, you have your ideology, you have your perspective, you have your beliefs, but also to focus on that, and to occasionally maybe affirm that your opponents disagree, but they're all Americans, and there are values that transcend that, human and democratic, small d democratic values that that we all share, even if we totally disagree on taxes or the environment or what have you.
Mike, did you have anything to add?
I'll quickly piggyback onto what Julia was saying and just say that news organizations that do not share or hide their bias are as American as apple pie, and that's been that's how most news organizations have been through most of our history. And with journalism professionalized more recently, and pursued a norm of objectivity and balance in reporting, but by and large, the news that we've had over the course of our country's history has been more ideological and has been more uncivil, and not great ends, but that is what we have.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question from the audience. Do you feel, I think this is couched in terms of journalists, so do journalists feel that part of the job is to calm the public who are most likely in a heightened state of fear about the election or these outcomes or the aftermath? To what extent do you think, either you think that that's part of the press's role, or do you think that they think that that's part of their role? And anyone can jump in.
I think that journalists tend to blanch at this, American journalists tend to blanch at the suggestion that they play a calming role when it comes to electoral politics. I think when it comes to military interventions abroad, when it comes to terror attacks on our soil, I think they do think that part of their job is to bring calm. But when it comes to politics, that opens them up to questions of bias. And I think that fear drives a lot of journalistic behavior that would move them away from, let's calm down, and this isn't a chaotic counting of ballots, or the election's contested through the court system, which is the way it's supposed to be contested. Those sorts of things. I don't think journalists see that as part of their job in the United States.
Anyone else?
I just agree with Mike, but also to say there's a lot of scenario planning going on in newsrooms right now. And I think there's a lot of fear that if things go badly and the count is delayed, yes, I really hope everything, as Mike just described, goes through. But if, for example, we have militia turning up at ballot counting locations and we have counter protesters, and then there's a lot of newsroom conversations about how do we cover that? How do we ensure that we are showing what's happening without actually stoking additional fears? And that those conversations are happening in newsrooms right now.
Great, thank you. Julia, did you have anything to add to that one?
No, it's fine.
Okay, so let me turn back to, we have a couple more minutes. We don't have any more audience questions at the moment, but I want to turn back to something that you guys kind of all touched on at one point or another that I think people will be interested in the response. So we've talked about the financial constraints facing, and there's obviously media system differences that Claire's been talking about too, which is also super interesting. But the press feel very constrained. And that's one reason we see this horse race framing and game frame coverage all the time for when it comes election season in particular, which is arguably not very informative, but that audiences tend to like. And that even extends to web and digital versions of these stories too. So I guess I have two questions really. One is, to what extent is the audience partly responsible and their preferences and behaviors for some of the trends that we see? And in particular, how do we expect, or how can we help journalists, or how can journalists think through various creative ways of, maybe adopting some new frames or some new approaches that would perhaps be more informative, but also keep some of the entertaining element that will keep audiences interested? Or should we even be worried about that? at this point? Not an easy one.
No. No. I mean, it seems to me like one possibility here is that there's a productive element to media fragmentation, and that there are some outlets that can serve an audience that is really looking for a deeper story, and that is typically how we think about our readers at 538, and that's one thing. And then there could be kind of a different model for people who are competing for a wider audience but have to compete with all these other more entertaining options. I think that there's something actually to be said about thinking differently about different kinds of audiences, and like that's okay. We have a big society of people that vary in their level of interest, but that all probably should have some basic level of understanding of what's going on.
I think part of the problem is that there are kind of at least two publics we want to think about serving, one of which are the political junkies who see balanced stories as biased against their side. And anytime you study it, you find it. And then there's the other folks who will not wake up living and dying with holding their government accountable today, but feel it's their civic duty to pay attention on occasion, to think about who they're going to vote for. And these two groups of people need different kinds of news coverage. And I think it's a way of kind of restating what Julia is saying about media fragmentation and its usefulness, but to think about that purposefully and saying there are lots of people who are helped by watching mainstream television news because it's the only opportunity they have to learn about what's going on, because they're not going to take the other opportunities that are afforded to them, and compare that to the people who are in a Zoom webinar on a Tuesday night with a bunch of PhDs talking about the 2020 election coverage.
That's a great point.
And I just, the third group, I think, is people who we haven't talked about them at all, the people who do not connect with mainstream media. Yeah. And I would say the first presidential debate, I watched Biden playing for the sound bites that would play on mainstream media. And President Trump understands that he has a networked audience. He was working the memes that would end up on t-shirts and mugs the next day. And he understood that his audience was taking what he was saying and shaping it to make sense for their own communities. And that, for me, is the last bunch of people. Like, they are going nowhere near the mainstream media, and they are getting what they need from their own Facebook pages and groups that reinforce their own beliefs. And I think by the time we get to 2024, those people are going to be even more large in number. And I think that's part of this puzzle that really needs thinking about as well.
I think that's right. Okay, well, that's a great point. I was going to ask one more thing, but I think we are right at time. And so it is my job now to say thanks to all of you panelists for this wonderful discussion. I also want to say thank you to the SSRC and Brooklyn History for hosting this, and all of the many wonderful discussions that they're hosting and for putting on this event. And to those of you who attended also, thanks very much for joining us.